This is the Bible Book Club.
And we're in Deuteronomy.
Welcome to the club. Last episode, we covered chapters 22 through 24, and Moses is still in the middle of his Just Do It sermon. And yes, we promise that Nike is not actually a sponsor of this podcast.
They should be, though.
They could be. If they want to. Call me, Nike.
They could have a face of Moses as their logo.
That would be really cool. He could be wearing Nike. Anyway, we digress.
At 120 years old.
but he was really, really athletic climbing up and down that mountain so many times.
He's going to climb it again to die. I mean, poor guy, no elevators.
All right, we're really getting off the subject. So let me bring you back to Moses and his Just Do It sermon. Last episode, we were listening to him expanding on his 7th and 8th commandment. Many of them were strange to us, and that is because these were created for a different set of people. These were created for Israel back when they were set apart from other nations, and it was all to prevent them from being tempted to be like the Canaanites. So it was things like wearing tassels on the 4 corners of your cloak and allowing Ammonite and Moabites to enter the assembly of the Lord. Other laws concerned offenses that dishonor a person or steal a person's dignity, like rape or human trafficking and war. The point here is they were to be set apart. They were not to behave like the Canaanites. Come on, Israelites, just do it.
And so the laws were most of them were very specific to them. They don't make sense to us because we don't have Ammonites and we don't have tassels and we don't need them.
I have a few things with tassels on them. I like tassels.
Well, in this episode, the Just Do It sermon is going to come to an end. Chapter 24 is going to be continued, and we're going to continue with obey the 9th commandment. Now, Exodus 20:16, the 9th commandment says this: "You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor." Moses is going to magnify this concept to include acting fairly and treating others with dignity. So here you have it, the first one, fair treatment of others.
Verse 8. In cases of defiling skin diseases, be very careful to do exactly as the Levitical priests instruct you. You must follow carefully what I have commanded them. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam along the way after you came out of Egypt.
Okay, here's one of those that doesn't apply to us today, but leprosy seems to have nothing to do with this command. And yet here we have this example of defiling skin diseases. And not all of those diseases were, in fact, leprosy. However, in Numbers 12, remember, Miriam spoke unjustly about Moses because of her dissatisfaction with his superior role compared to hers and Aaron's. And she grumbled about it, and she grumbled about him. As a result, God struck Miriam with leprosy for speaking against Moses. This meant that Miriam was ostracized from the camp. Remember, if you had those kind of diseases, you had to go outside the camp so nobody else would catch it. And her exile could have been permanent, as some skin diseases were incurable at the time, and that's why they had leprosy camps. But Miriam submitted to Moses. She felt bad about her rebellion, and God was kind and healed her so that she could come back into the camp. And what God is saying in this is, you Israelites should be fair to your leaders. Don't rebel against them and submit to them so that God can be kind to you. Continuing on.
Verse 10, when you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into their house to get what is offered to you as a pledge. Stay outside and let the neighbor to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. If the neighbor is poor, do not go to sleep with their pledge in your possession. Return their cloak by sunset so that your neighbor may sleep in it. Then they will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord your God.
Okay, remember, this is about fair treatment, this whole commandment. And if you can remember from other verses that we've studied, loaning money to a fellow Israelite was really not supposed to make money. You weren't supposed to make money loaning money.
There was no interest allowed.
You were supposed to loan the money in an effort to help the person get back on their feet. So in this, he addresses the fair treatment of a person who pledges security on a loan. When someone loans another person money and takes a pledge of something valuable in exchange for the loan in case they can't pay it back. The lender should respect the other person's privacy. They should not barge into their home and take the security forcefully. They should be kind when they come to get it. And if the borrower is poor and needs the security, like it's their cloak, which I guess in those days
they
their
would
cloak
freeze if they didn't have
correct.
it.
The lender is to give them the cloak back when they need it, if it's cold. Because again, you're trying to help this person get on their feet. If they get sick, they're not going to get back on their feet. So you have to be kind and respect the person, even when you lend money.
And the fact that he has to say it kind of says to me that they were doing these things.
Yeah, just like we do today.
Sad.
Verse
14, do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and they're counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin.
So I think people lived much more in the moment back then, because most of the commentaries say you need to pay them at sundown so they can buy food for that night. Like people literally lived hand to mouth. So this is about fair wages. Hired workers were vulnerable people because they were landless, or they had to, lease out their land because they couldn't support it. So they were already in a bad position. Exploiting poor people was forbidden to the Jews, and wages were to be paid every single day. Now, James in the New Testament goes even further about this, warning us against riches and oppressive gains in James 5. He also, in that verse, reaffirms what Moses said, that God hears the cries of the unpaid and the harvesters.
James chapter 5. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty.
So this is in the New Testament, something we need to ponder as we, those of us who run businesses or have employees, think about, are we paying them fairly, or are we looking more to our own gains from their labor?
Now back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, starting in verse 16. Parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin.
There were a lot of times in Israel when parents were responsible for their misbehavior of their children, like being disrespectful and not honoring their parents, etc. Here, there is fair treatment for crime. And in this case, that means individuals in a family are not responsible for any kind of legal crime that other family members commit. So if it was a legal thing, like maybe they killed somebody, by accident, we've talked about that before, the child is older and is out working in the fields and accidentally kills somebody, the parent is not responsible. The child is and has to go to it. And vice versa. If a father is out there killing somebody, the child or the wife are not responsible for that.
Verse 17, do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take a cloak off the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner and fatherless and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this.
I love the verses throughout the Bible that take care of the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, because they could not be landowners, and therefore they couldn't support themselves other than by picking up a trade or something like that. And so, throughout all of time, women and children have been at risk when the head of the household is killed. Not so much now, but back then a lot, and even in the hundreds of years since then, till about 50 years ago. Fair treatment for the alien, orphan, and widow is special because they are vulnerable, just like the Israelites were in Egypt. And because God heard the Israelites' cries and set the Israelites free, So should the Israelites show compassion and not take advantage of the weak. They deserve justice. No lender may take a widow's cloak or covering for the night, and they must allow the poor to glean in the fields for food. And there's some really beautiful stories about that coming up in Ruth.
All right, moving on to chapter 25. When people have a dispute, they are to take it to court, and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty person deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make them lie down and have them flogged in his presence with the number of lashes the crime deserves. But the judge must not impose more than 40 lashes. If the guilty party is flogged more than that, your fellow Israelite will be degraded in your eyes.
This is hard to listen to. It's fair treatment for punishment. They tried to make it a little more objective, and it has to be done before, the judge is a witness to make sure that it doesn't get bad. But ouch, 40 lashes. Hopefully they don't get that many, but we know Jesus did.
How many did Jesus get?
I think it was 40, was it not? He got the maximum. And really, I don't know at what point you're literally tearing the skin off their back, and depending on what you're using.
Do it with, something that would tear the skin.
But I do love that it says, your fellow Israelite will be degraded in your eyes. There's a point at which you are degraded.
Yeah,
and
it's unusual and inhumane.
And the commentaries were harsh on it. They said it's like you're treating the person as an animal, which I take offense to, because what about the poor animals? You can't beat them either. And it's true, but you're treating them as if they were lower than a dog. Okay, so for Jesus, it was 39. Like, they stopped just short of totally degrading him, but it was in effect the same.
Yeah, those Pharisees, they knew the law, and they were intent on keeping it, so they had to keep it under 40, I guess.
Exactly.
All right, moving on. Verse 4, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain.
This concerns fair treatment of animals. To keep an animal from eating while working surrounded by food is cruel. So this is like the ox goes around in a circle, and he treads the grain. He walks on the sheaves, and the grain sifts through to the bottom. I don't know how they did it, but it did. What they're saying here is don't muzzle him so he can't eat as he goes. It's not fair to be salivating, surrounded by food and hungry, and not be able to eat because you've muzzled him. It's not compassionate. Let the animals eat is what he's saying here. Now, Paul uses this phrase twice in 1 Corinthians 9 and in 1 Timothy 5 as an example that just as God requires fair treatment of animals while working, he requires the same compassion for people. So I guess some people are treating their animals better than their people. All right, moving on to just do it. Obey the 10th commandment. We are hitting the end here. Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. This section develops the 10th commandment, but very broadly. You shall not covet your neighbor's life, and similarly, you shall respect and care for your neighbor's life.
Verse 5. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up with him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled.
All right, what they're talking about here is caring for your brother's life through the levirate marriage. The main idea behind the levirate is that if a man died without a male heir, in other words, his life is gone, you have to care for that life that's gone. His brother should marry his widow, and if they have a son, that son would inherit the deceased brother's name and property. It's like being a surrogate father. The practice ensured that the property would remain within the family. Because remember, the property follows the son, the heir. And this is like you're having an heir for your brother who can't have an heir because he's dead. And the dead brother's name would be carried forward. There are two great examples of this in the Bible. In Genesis 38, Judah does the wrong thing. He keeps his son, one of his sons, from a Levirate marriage with Tamar. Now, Tamar did not like this at all and tricked Judah, by dressing up as a prostitute, into being the Levir himself and fulfilling the requirement because she got pregnant with twins. In the book of Ruth, Boaz graciously steps up as the Levir, even though he was not the closest relative. Both Judah and Boaz, even though one did it willingly, one did it unwillingly, both of them earn a place in the lineage of Christ Hall of Fame in Matthew 1. So
just
way to
for
go.
Being obedient to God.
Way to go. Well, Judah wasn't even obedient, but he apologized when he realized what Tamar did because she was correct and he was in the wrong. And he was dishonoring his son. So moving on.
Verse 11, if two men are fighting and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant and she reaches out and seizes him by his private parts, you shall cut off her hand. Show her no pity.
This sounds crazy.
Really weird.
I know, really weird. But again, this continuing of the line through an heir was so important to them because that's how you kept property in the family. So take care you don't limit another's ability to create a life, and the private parts are off limits. It appears that in this case, the wife's intervention injured the other man permanently, and he cannot have children. Children and heirs in particular were, like I said, so important because the promised land was tied to the sons. So you could not offend a man in his private parts.
Verse 13, do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy, one light. Do not have two differing measures in your house, one large, one small. You must have accurate and honest weights and measures so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly.
Yeah, this really does have to do with the 10th commandment, coveting, because if you cheat somebody, and that's what they were doing, they were coveting another's money and cheating them. Apparently, this was a common thing. It was a common way to fleece someone out of a little money because stones were used for measurement and they were not uniform in weight. So you could actually have two sets of stones that looked just alike, but one was made of a softer material, a lighter material, and you could fleece somebody. So that was just not kind. Now, next we move on to an aside. It doesn't really apply to the 10th commandment. And it's this unfinished business with the Amalekites.
Verse 17, remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you and the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget.
The Amalekites were nomadic descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. And remember, the Edomites were protected by God when they traveled up through Moab. God said, you cannot attack the Edomites because they're your relatives. However, the Amalekites attacked the Israelites in Exodus 17, and in the battle that ensued, Joshua made his very first Bible appearance and was victorious. So because they attacked, God is saying, you need to take care of them. And especially because when they attacked the rear of how the camp, we talked about how the camp of Israelites set out and marched out. Well, there were always stragglers behind it. And it was the weak people, who were vulnerable, who kind of straggled behind the camp. And that's who they attacked, those crummy Amalekites. And so God doesn't like that. And he says, go have at them. Chapter 26.
When you have entered the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance and have taken possession of it and settled in it, take some of the first fruits of all that you produce from the soil of the land the Lord your God is giving you and put them in a basket. Then go to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name and say to the priest in office at the time, I declare today to the Lord your God that I have come to the land the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. The priest shall take the basket from your hands and set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. Then you shall declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there, and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, Lord, have given me. Place the basket before the Lord your God and bow down before him. Then you and the Levites and the foreigners residing among you shall rejoice in all the good things the Lord your God has given you and your household.
Finally, Moses is saying here, take care not to covet what is God's by making these 3 declarations. And declaration number 1 is a presentation of the first produce from the promised land. The land was a gift from God, and the produce of the land was a gift from God. This inaugural tithe of first fruits would have been a really big deal. It would be a pilgrimage for some to the sanctuary, because remember, we don't know where the sanctuary is right now, so people are going to have to travel. And it validated that their new life as landowners, they were no longer enslaved or nomads, because remember, they were nomads for 40 years. The fruits of the promise fulfilled would be there for all to witness as they all gathered for this tithe.
So he's kind of saying, like, when you get the blessing that God has promised you, and he's saying this today to you, when you get the promise that God has blessed you with, then tithe.
Declare it.
Is
and
basically
declare it.
saying, yeah. And
he's saying
tell
declare
everyone
it
proudly.
Right.
Yeah.
And give God the credit publicly. And that's what they're doing. They're celebrating it, but they're also making this declaration that this is God's. And they're not coveting what is God's, the first fruits, because that's how we show that he's first in our lives, is to give him the best.
Continuing on in verse 12, when you have finished setting aside 1/10 of all your produce in the 3rd year, the year of the tithe, you shall give it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. Then say to the Lord your God, I have removed from my house the sacred portion and have given it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all you commanded. I have not turned aside from your commands, nor have I forgotten any of them. I have not eaten any of the sacred portion while I was in mourning, nor have I removed any of it while I was unclean, nor have I offered any of it to the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God. I have done everything you commanded me. Look down from heaven, your holy dwelling place, and bless your people Israel and the land you have given us, as you promised on oath to our ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey.
So this 3rd year tithe, along with, remember, we have the 7-year sabbatical. These kind of years were years where they had to trust that there would be enough. In this 3rd year, God would provide enough for them to take care of other people. The Levites who served them in the towns, the orphan, the widow, the alien. And they were to, again, declaration number 2, declare it. I have given what I needed to give this tithe to others. I haven't given it to the dead. I haven't done wrong with it. God gave me an abundance in this year, and I have given it away to the right people. And this is an act of obedience. This tithe would not take place at the sanctuary. It would take place in the towns. What they had to give served their town, the poor in their town. It was to be shared with everyone in their community who had a need, including the Levites. The reference to the dead may have been instituted by Moses as a reminder to them to declare that they have not partaken in any cult practices.
Again, be set apart. Don't do like the Canaanites.
And it was public, this declaration. It's like, okay, everybody come clean. give your tithe up and declare it. And everybody would probably come forward and offer. And it would be like Christmas Day for those who are poor. It'd be so fun.
Verse 16, the Lord your God commands you this day to follow these decrees and laws, carefully observe them with all your heart and with all your soul. You have declared this day that the Lord is your God, and that you will walk in obedience to him, that you will keep his decrees, commands, and laws, that you will listen to him. And the Lord has declared this day that you are his people, his treasured possession as he promised, and that you are to keep all his commands. He has declared that he will set you in praise, fame, and honor high above all the nations he has made, and that you will be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he promised.
All right, this is declaration 3 that Moses wants them to make. And that declaration is that God and Israel are covenant partners. They're at the point where they're going to enter into an agreement. This declaration is similar to the declaration made at the end of the book of the covenant in Exodus 24 with that first generation, where they declared they were going to do all these things. This is what they're declaring. The people will declare they will walk in his ways, keep his commands, and listen to him with all their heart and soul. In return, the people will be God's people, his treasured possession. This declaration, just like the one in Exodus 24, is of mutual commitments. They're going to walk in his ways, do these things for God, and he's going to call them his people, his treasured possession. And they're making these declarations in preparation for the covenant renewal, which is coming up next, because this is the end of chapter 26, and it is the end of the second sermon for the Israelites to just do it. Do everything God commands, including what they said they do in the declaration. Now, there was a lot in these chapters that was commanded. Too much for a sinful man to keep, which is why the New Testament pivots to the new covenant. God had a better way for us, and Paul explains it like this.
Galatians 3, verse 7. Understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham. Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who rely on faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. As it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Clearly, no one who relies on the law is justified before God, because the righteous will live by faith. The law is not based on faith. On the contrary, it says, the person who does these things will live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit.
In the next chapter, we will find out exactly how cursed an Israelite could become. It is not pretty, but for the grace of God, we could be under that same curse. However, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Before we move to the next chapter, I want you to remember, Deuteronomy is a series of 3 speeches for Moses, containing his final words to encourage the next generation of Israel to be faithful to their God. The first sermon, chapters 1 through 11, was the Remember sermon. The Israelites were to remember everything God had done for them in the past, how God multiplied them despite their slavery, the miracles God did before Pharaoh, how God provided for them in the wilderness, the protection and victories over their enemies, and the provision of the promised land. He had a case for them to remember him. He had totally taken care of them. The second sermon, chapters 12 through 26, which we just completed, was the Just Do It sermon. Moses instructed the Israelites about how to obey the laws when they were living in the promised land. He's telling them, just do this, do everything I say, and you'll be fine. Most of the laws were from Mount Sinai when he gave the original law. Some were new or expanded. Many of the laws were strange to us because they were created to protect Israel from adopting the evil practices of Canaan, such as child sacrifice and fertility worship. Israel was called to be set apart, different from other nations. The laws about justice, marriage, business, and the protection of aliens, orphans, and widows set the nation Israel apart from the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Canaanites. They were different. Well, Moses moves on from here to the third sermon. The Israelites know what they need to know to live in the land. When they get there, without him, Moses wants them to renew the covenant they made at Mount Sinai in the Promised Land, just like they did when they left Egypt and were at Mount Sinai. Moses is asking the Israelites once again to choose God. That's the theme of this next section. In this final sermon, with just a few chapters left in the Torah, life is draining from Moses with every word that he speaks, and the Israelites might not be listening.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Hayley Mawat.